Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today I'm joined by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who's a retired combat veteran, a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense under the first Trump presidency, a prolific author, as well as a military analyst. But for those who follow this channel, of course, you're already quite familiar with him. So welcome, Colonel. It's good to see you again.
Good to be with you, Glenn.
So I really wanted to discuss the new developments here in Europe, specifically with Russia, given that until very recently it appeared that the Ukraine war had reached its end. That is, the Ukrainian military had exhausted itself. The society began to post the war. A majority of Ukrainians now are even willing to give up some territory, and there's not even a single oblast anymore in Ukraine who favors continued fighting, according to the recent Gallup polls. But furthermore, we saw Trump winning the election with a solid mandate, as he promised to end the proxy war. And we saw Scholz from Germany even calling Putin, suggesting that this is the end of the boycott of diplomacy. And I just got back from this Valdai meeting in Russia, where also a key topic was how to win the peace now that the war is coming seemingly to an end. So there was a lot of reason to be optimistic until the end of last week. And then this week begins, and Biden announced that the US had authorized the attack, or at least this was reported in the New York Times, that the US had authorized attacks on Russia with long-range missiles. And shortly thereafter, the Bryansk region of Russia was attacked. So for Russia's argument is that this crosses a line that the United States then becomes now a direct participant in the war, and they are now very vocal about their intention to retaliate. So, I was wanting really to ask a bit wider question. That is, what is going on, and how are you interpreting the decision to attack Russia in this way, and also the ambiguity, because there doesn't seem to be much of a confirmation, even though the attack has already occurred.
Glenn, thank you. This idea of suddenly providing long-range strike weapons to reach targets inside Russia is analogous in military terms to giving a heart patient that is already close to death a haircut and a shave, and insist that this somehow or another will improve the state of the patient. The patient is already on life support and will die, regardless of what we do at this stage. That's the sad truth. Ukraine is now in worse condition than it's ever been. And even Zelensky admitted that if the aid from the United States ceased, it would be over. So the Russians are puzzled by our behavior because obviously President Trump won the election. Keep in mind that our globalist friends that are ruling the West these days, whether it's Germany, France, or anywhere in Europe for the most part, and then in the United States, harp constantly on this thing of democracy, 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 and have pretended that somehow or another Trump's election would end democracy. Yet they show nothing but contempt for democracy. We just had an election. The vast majority of Americans have absolutely no interest in going to war with anyone, least of all with Russia, which is the one power on the planet that has the strength and the capability to destroy us, as I think we all know. So this is a sort of a refutation of democracy here inside the United States by the people that try to identify themselves with it. I think at the same time in Europe, unless I'm very, very wrong, the Germans in particular are apoplectic. That is, we would say they are beside themselves in their opposition to going to war with Russia. And Scholz very recently said he would provide nothing more to the Ukrainians. All of a sudden now he's decided he's going to release some number of unmanned systems, I guess. And of course, the government in London is permanently off its meds and out of therapy. And I think as a result, this man Starmer is a committed globalist who wants to wage war in perpetuity against Russia. When he's been questioned, don't you realize this could put us in the United Kingdom in jeopardy? He just dismisses it out of hand. The same thing is true for Macron. Macron is hanging on by his fingernails politically. I think Stormer will be thrown out of office. He may actually face a rebellion inside his own country for the first time in several centuries. And Scholz, what authority does this man actually have? So they are very much like Biden. All of them are at the end of their respective tenures. They're on the road to nowhere. If anything, they're on the road to political disaster. And this is sort of a last act of defiance that has no chance of changing anything. Now, the real question, and you were in Russia recently, and you're probably better positioned to answer this than I am, is will this provoke a nuclear response from Russia? Well, I think you have to read very carefully what is in the new definition of the circumstances in Russian under which they would consider use of a nuclear weapon. And it suggests that a large-scale attack could provoke that. We haven't seen a large-scale attack. Now, could we? I suppose if every ATACMS they still have in the inventory and every Storm Shadow missile or Scalpel missile that may still be in the inventory were fired simultaneously, then that could be construed as an overwhelming attack that might provoke a nuclear response. But I still think that President Putin, who has always been restrained in this direction, and right away I go back to Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, who made it very clear at the BRICS summit that Russia wants to avoid a nuclear war. I think instead what we are going to see is mass destruction of what remains of Ukraine. And I think that message was sent with the destruction of the power grid over the weekend in Western Ukraine, and more recently, the strikes that we've witnessed in the last 24 hours. These are devastating. They're meant to be devastating because they're signaling no more nonsense. And I think that Putin is very close to concentrating force to go straight into Kiev. And he may also cross the river to go to Odessa before he's through. He's certainly going to take Kharkov. That's, without question. At what point does all of this finally sink in with the West that there is no room for negotiating any solution that leaves Ukraine in the hands of the enemy? That's unacceptable. And the British are in the forefront of trying to build up forces, I'm told, inside Ukraine for insurgent operations against the Russians. This is sheer lunacy. This will get millions of Ukrainians killed needlessly. It'll sabotage any economic recovery and doom whatever is left of the Ukrainian state to eternal destruction. So I think the Russians are sitting on top of a victory. They want this to end. They want Ukraine to be neutral. They want to put an end to the suffering everywhere, not only in Ukraine, but in their own country, because this war always has an impact at home, as he knows. Will he be able to do that? And that's entirely in the hands of Donald Trump, because it's obvious that until President Trump takes over, there will be no end to the stupidity.
But still, if Trump was taking over next week, one could maybe expect the Russians to be a bit restrained. Again, I remember back in 2016 when Obama began to sabotage relations right before he left office through expulsion and closure of the consulate and different sanctions. It was intended to make difficult relations between the Russians and the Americans, but this is something very different. This is seen as a direct attack, and it's also 2 months left. And well, I think you very correctly pointed out that Putin has shown a lot of restraints, but this is also something that's been criticized for in Russia, because this is seen as emboldening NATO, reasonably so. I always make the point that you can only look at any of our media. We kind of say, the Russians, they don't do anything when they cross the red lines. We can do what we want. The NATO deterrent is too powerful. But this is something very different, striking Russia directly with these long-range missiles. And again, if they do not respond to this, then it's open season on Russia. Then all the West is now a little bit cautious, it seems, a bit restrained to see how the Russians react. If they do nothing, then all of this ambiguity about America being behind it, or the limitations imposed on the ATACMS, all of this will probably begin to go away. So the Russians are under an immense pressure to now strike back. But how do you see a possible retaliation? Is it only, of course, more ruthless attacks on Ukraine seems quite predictable and evident now, but what else could we expect? Do you see any possibilities of going after satellites or NATO targets on NATO soil or American military bases anywhere else in the world. What do you think is the going through the minds of the people in the Kremlin who now believe that this is, they have to strike now, and it has to be at least a bit of a bloody nose in order to make the West reconsider this approach of attacking Russia directly?
Well, if that is the mindset, and you would be in a position to know that better than I right now, if that in fact is the mentality, there are many, many things that the Russians can do without necessarily striking simply in Ukraine. They could pick targets in Western Europe. They could destroy the British bases on Cyprus. That could be done within minutes, given Russian missile power. I still don't think that that's something that President Putin feels compelled to do. I think what he will do is something along the lines of what I just described. I think you're going to see not only more and more devastating assaults and attacks on targets inside Western Ukraine, but I think you're going to see the movement of the ground force into Kiev. I think that decision is, if it hasn't been made, it's going to be made, because there's a recognition of what you said earlier. The Russians aren't fools. They know the Ukrainian people have had enough of this war. That's been true for some time. The losses are horrific. All we do is continue to lie about everything in the West and say, oh no, the losses on the Russian side are heavy. Well, they're not heavy. They're also not inconsequential. I mean, the Russians don't want to take losses. They want this over with. But they may recognize that they have no choice now but to root out and utterly destroy the Zelensky regime. I would be very surprised if steps in that direction are not taken in the near future. And that may alleviate the problem, frankly, because once that regime is gone, then you're left with rogue elements of U.S. and British intelligence services trying to stage a fighting retreat as they're driven out of Western Ukraine. At some point, the Ukrainians themselves may try to drive them out in order to put an end to this. That's how bad it could get. But will he escalate horizontally in other directions? That's always a possibility. But I think he'll try to do the first things that I've described. Now, there is one thing we need to address, because we continue to hear this nonsense. There are no North Korean troops on the ground in Ukraine. The North Korean forces are all in eastern Siberia. That is not new. They have rotated in and out of that area for a long time. Remember, North Korea has a border with Russia. They have rail lines between North Korea and Russia. The Russians routinely supply the North Koreans with grain, with other foodstuffs, in return for which the North Koreans provide steel, various kinds of commodities that North Korea has. But there is no intention and there is no need for the Russian military to employ North Korean forces against the Ukrainians. So I hope that people will stop talking about it. It's a lie perpetrated once again by the intelligence services in London and Washington.
I'm a bit surprised. I come across this argument many times in the media, but also on different debates in which is saying, well, there's thousands of North Koreans fighting in Ukraine and in Kursk, yet no one seems to have evidence of a single North Korean participating, not a photo or a video. So it's a bit surprising it's gone this far. But I was curious though if this is intended to have if not a psychological effect, to have at least function as a possible deterrent. That is, if NATO escalates in Ukraine, that the Russians can at least threaten with the option of sending in North Koreans in. I can see why they wouldn't. It would be very hard to harmonize these forces, but as something hanging over the heads of the NATO warhawks, that because nobody wants North Korean entering Europe, that is European Russia or Ukraine. Did you see a possibility that they could be triggered as a part of a deterrent, or not really?
No, I think that's utter nonsense. Russia has no need of foreign troops. This is part of the larger lie that somehow or another the Russians are bleeding and they don't have enough men. Or, this goes back to the other lies that have been told over the last 3 years. Oh, they don't have enough munitions. They don't have enough missiles. They don't have enough of this or that or the next thing. I've gotten accustomed to the tendency to impute to the Russians what we ourselves are struggling with. We're the ones that don't have the munitions and the missiles and the rockets. We don't have vast assembly lines turning out thousands of copies of Patriot missiles or anything else. So I think it's a case of imputing to them what really afflicts us. And we have a soldier problem. We can't fill the ranks of the United States Armed Forces. We have ships at sea that are undermanned. We have battalions in the Army that are not fully manned. We have equipment that's quite old. We haven't kept up in either organizational or materiel terms with modernization. We've depended too heavily on what we think are silver bullet solutions. Oh, a new missile in the Air Force or the Navy, which solves our problems. It's all nonsense. It's all going to be exposed. Here's the other point too, Glenn. There is a tendency to forget that what happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. In other words, what we're doing there is going to further sabotage and undermine any efforts that we might make under President Trump for peace in the Middle East. Now, I know that President Trump is viewed as someone who has unconditionally supported whatever Israel wants. But once he's president of the United States and finally looks clearly without interference at what American interests are, I don't think he's going to be very excited about committing the United States to a war on behalf of Israel against everyone in the Middle East, because that's what it will come down to. So again, why would you poison the waters with Russia at this late point in the war? This is not something that's good for the United States. It's not good for Trump's future administration. This is a bitter expression of anger and frustration with the simple fact that most people in the West don't want the globalist agenda. If you go back and read Solzhenitsyn, one of the most illustrative statements in his work that no one pays much attention to is, why were there gulags to begin with? Why were the Soviets compelled early on in the 1920s to set up concentration camps that ultimately held millions of people in slavery? Millions died long before there were any camps of any kind under the Nazis. Why was that necessary? It was necessary because communism didn't work. It was a failure. The only way communism could work was to put a gun to everyone's head. Well, effectively, that's what the globalists have discovered. But they haven't got the machinery that Lenin had. And so the only thing they can do is push us into a set of circumstances in which we cannot easily escape. In other words, to push us towards war and conflict in the hopes that that will rescue their aspirations. That's about all I can see. Again, this is back to the original comment. This is the antithesis of democracy. The people in the EU, the people at the top in London and Paris and Berlin and in Washington are fundamentally anti-democratic. That's the problem. They are authoritarians. They want their way or the highway, as we say in English. And they're not going to get their way. They just lost the election.
Yeah, there is something very undemocratic about this, I guess. I saw first from France, where they had Macron's party come in third, but they still demand to rule. You have in Germany, the main opposition now coming up, AfD. They're openly discussing banning the main opposition. And now, of course, in the United States, people voted overwhelmingly for Trump. People forget he also won the popular vote by about 5 million votes. So this was a huge mandate to end the proxy war, which was a key issue in his platform. And again, what do? They attempt to sabotage this 2 months before he takes over the presidency. It's difficult to explain how any of this, of course, is harmonizes with the idea of democracy.
Well, Glenn, there is another thing to consider here, and I remember this with great clarity since I lived through it in 1964, 65. Barry Goldwater was the name of the man who ran on the Republican ticket against Lyndon Johnson after President Kennedy was assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson ran for election as president. And Goldwater said, if you elect me, I will go to Vietnam. I will use whatever military force is necessary, up to and including nuclear weapons, to defeat communism in Southeast Asia. Lyndon Johnson said, that's outrageous. We will never do that. And so as soon as Lyndon Johnson gets into office, well, not as soon as, but very quickly, we discover we're on our way to Vietnam. The only difference between Johnson and Goldwater was that Goldwater wanted some sort of immediate striking victory that he thought he could achieve with a nuclear weapon if needed. And Johnson was willing to fight on the conventional level in a counterinsurgency, which had no chance of success. But the bottom line is we still got ultimately what the American people did not want. They voted for Lyndon Johnson because they didn't want to go to Vietnam. So we went to Vietnam. I see this as being very similar with certainly the Obama administration and subsequently this Biden administration. We people don't seem to understand that the things that are promised are never delivered by the left, by the globalists. In fact, what they're giving us is what we don't want. And then they're telling us that we're stupid because we vote against it. We're stupid because we don't want to go to war against Russia. We're stupid because we don't want to go to war with every Muslim country in the world on behalf of Israel. It's insane.
Yeah, because overall, the American public has tended to vote for less militarism. I remember after the presidency of Clinton, people voted for Trump for Bush because he was strongly against nation building before, of course, putting nation building on steroids. Then people elected Obama because he offered change. There was no change, and then the same with Biden. He ran on, returning to normality, and and of course now it's a possible nuclear war with Russia and invasion of Iran and massive Middle Eastern wars. This is doesn't feel normal, at least. But I wanted to ask you, given your military background, how are these missiles operated? Because a key argument for the Russians that this could completely bulldozes through a red line is that it amounts to a direct involvement or even a direct attack. So the argument is, yes, these are American missiles, and if they were merely supplied as a way of giving military assistance for a country to defend itself, which has suffered greatly, then it can still fall under even proxy war. But the argument is that these missiles are completely dependent on American soldiers to operate them, and they're dependent on American intelligence and targeting, and also American satellites to actually guide them towards striking the Russian troops and logistics centers and ammo depots. So how do you read if this is all American? Is this correct? And if so, to what extent is Ukraine even involved in these attacks on Russia?
Essentially, President Putin and his government are correct. Take us out of the equation, and this war would not be going on right now. It would have ended a long time ago. And yes, our technicians, and I would say technicians because the military personnel you're discussing, there are some there undoubtedly, but the majority are not employed by the armed forces. In other words, they're not soldiers in the United States Army per se. But they are people with that experience in their background, and they are hired as civilians to operate these things. Same thing is true on the British side, although the British have been far and far more aggressive with their SAS, their special ops groups, and Royal Marines than we have been with our forces inside the country. I think there are a couple of things happening that we should take note of. Number one is what President Putin is saying is that this notion of a nuclear umbrella, that if you step 1 foot into Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Romania, Britain, wherever, or Norway, that the United States is going to push the button and suddenly it's mutually assured destruction is nonsense. In other words, he's saying the nuclear umbrella is a bluff. He's right. It has been for a long time. In fact, by the end of the 1960s, we had adopted this thing we call flexible response because we did not want to be dragged unilaterally by any particular state anywhere in the world into a nuclear confrontation with the Soviets or anybody else. Today, the idea of automatically responding to anything the Russians might do with a nuclear weapon is off the table. And frankly, from the Russian standpoint, they don't want to use nuclear weapons unless they face what was termed an overwhelming attack with other kinds of weapons on the soil of White Russia or Russia. So that's why I say I think this will trigger a response that's similar to what we saw last night and a ground assault on Kiev. I think that's just absolutely within reach right now of the Russian army, as is the acquisition of Odessa and securing Kharkov. But I don't see nuclear weapons being used to do that. They don't need nuclear weapons for it. Again, this is the other thing in development. If you go back and look at Colonel General Gareev, Mahmoud Gareev, he's still alive as far as I know. And he wrote a very excellent book called If War Comes Tomorrow. This is 20 years ago. And he made the point repeatedly that nuclear weapons have lost their value because they're too destructive. You could achieve the same outcome with precision-guided munitions, precision-guided missiles and rockets, with new forms of explosive that are even more devastating than anything we've ever seen in the past. And the Russians have many weapons like that. They don't need a nuclear weapon anymore. And you can achieve precision attack, which means that you're destroying the target, the military target or the infrastructure target that has military utility, as opposed to killing large numbers of people that you would rather not kill. That's where Russia is. So the notion that they have to turn to a nuclear weapon is simply not true. Can they be pushed to it? And that's really what you're asking. How much more can we do to push the Russians into a corner where they feel they have no alternative but to use a nuclear weapon? I think that's going to be hard for us to do because we don't have the wherewithal, as we were discussing earlier. We don't have the arsenals that are full to the brim of all the kinds of missiles and munitions that we would need. So again, I think this is a bluff on the part of the globalists. They're trying to bluff and buffalo Russia, and so they turn around and say, well, see, the Russians are bluffing. The Russians are not bluffing. They're quite serious, but they don't need a nuclear weapon to achieve their aims. What they're essentially telling us is that if you do these things, there will be no negotiation of any kind with anybody. And we can fight this longer than you can. And I think the Russians have demonstrated their capacity for endurance and staying power much better than we have. I mean, what are we going to do? Send in NATO ground forces? No. Are we going to send in NATO air forces? I don't see much evidence for that. Everybody talks about how superior our air forces are. Maybe on a technological level, many of those aircraft that we possess are the best. But how do they fare against integrated air and missile defenses? And again, we have virtually no air and missile defense. 5% of NATO can be protected by what we have. They have the capacity to protect most of their population centers, as well as most of their what we would call high-value targets. But even they can't protect everything, but they're in much better condition than we are. So I think, Glenn, what you have seen within the last 24 to 48 hours is going to intensify. And I think we're going to see Russian forces move on Kyiv without question.
Yeah, but I'm thinking even if there was a possibility, that's why I'm so curious about the motivation for this. Even if it was a possibility to turn the tide of the war, what are we expecting the Russians to do here? I mean, they're very genuine that they see a loss as being an existential threat. That would be the end of Russia. That is, they see themselves with the back to the wall. This is now everything or nothing. Meanwhile, we keep escalating without having any diplomatic outs. It's just there has to be a limit to how far we can push the Russians, how they're engaging in this direct strikes, getting so deeply involved in attacking Russia, and still being so confident that they simply want to retaliate because, that they're so deterred and worried. I mean, it seems, it's starting to seem more and more crazy to me, though. This is
well, Glenn, I think we need to be frank about this. Who are the people with their backs to the wall? They're in Berlin, Paris, London, and Washington. The old regime is dying. The globalists have lost. The population everywhere doesn't want them. And they're operating on borrowed time. So this is sort of a last act of defiance. This is not something significant that will compel the Russians to stop or halt in any way. On the contrary, this is going to trigger greater intensity and greater aggressiveness on the Russian side than we have seen to date. That is pretty clear to me. But will it trigger a nuclear response? No, not at this point. But it's useful for everyone to understand what I said before. If every existing, Storm Shadow missile, Scalpel missile, ATACMS, MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, if they were all somehow or another concentrated and shot at once, yes, that could precipitate the nuclear response. I don't see that happening because I just don't think we have enough missiles to go around to make a dent. It's really kind of strange. We keep insisting that the Russians are this imminent threat, that if Ukraine can't join NATO at some point, the world will end and everything will be lost. But there's no evidence for that because the Russians don't really want to go any further west. As I've said over and over and over again to people, the Russians don't really want to govern Ukrainians. They recognize that the Ukrainians should govern themselves. They simply want that state to be neutral and not a threat to Russia, which seems eminently reasonable to me. If I, as an American, saw something similar happening in Mexico, I don't think that we would have been nearly as restrained as the Russians have been. And we would demand a similar outcome. Get all the foreign forces out and neutralize yourself. If you don't do that, we'll annihilate you. And I think we would do so without hesitation. So this is all nonsense, what's happening right now. Again, it's a last desperate attempt to signal some sort of capability that really isn't there, to breathe life into the comatose body of Ukraine. Ukraine is dead. I think we need to, for the sake of the few people that remain in that country, we need to end this as quickly as possible.
I couldn't agree more. But this is also part of the dishonesty, I guess, because we keep being told that once the Russians have done with Ukraine, they're going to go invade Poland for God knows what reason. But at the same time, we're explaining to our public that we can do whatever we want against the Russians because they do not dare to attack NATO. So it's a lot of dishonesty. But I wanted to ask you, though, about what Trump might do, because again, this is the elephant in the room, and probably one of the key reasons why Biden decided to attack with these long-range missiles as well. But I've seen, some calls already from the members of U.S. Congress to have Biden removed under the 25th Amendment. General Flynn argued that the world might not last 2 months with Biden, and suggesting that we should, that he should be replaced again under the same amendment. But Trump has been somewhat quiet. I know his son went out and argued that Trump Jr. that this was intended to sabotage his efforts to end the war. But what is do you know what Trump's position on all of this is, and how will he respond?
Well, as I wrote in the American Conservative, none of us knows exactly what Trump will do. We also do not know when the relative stillness in the Middle East will end between Israel and Iran. Well, we just don't know. I don't know. I suspect that one of the things that worries me are some of the people advising President Trump who are telling him that whatever agreement he reaches with President Putin when he's finally inaugurated has to somehow or another look like a quote unquote win for him. I think that's ridiculous nonsense. I think ending this war will be a win for Ukraine and a win for Europe so that the two can get back to business as usual. A win for us is to end the hostility with Russia and treat it as another great power with whom we can sometimes cooperate and with whom sometimes we cannot cooperate. But this doesn't mean that we should be hostile with them or they to us. I hope that that's where President Trump has ended. As I've said before, the intelligent thing to do, because we've lied so routinely and so prolifically to the Russians, is to say nothing but do the following. Number one, end, suspend, stop all military aid to Ukraine immediately. Done. Number two, demand or direct the withdrawal of all U.S. personnel, and I mean all U.S. citizens in or out of uniform, including the intelligence services, everyone out of Ukraine, period. Those two things need to happen immediately. If he does those two things, this war will stop. Then there can be discussions about what the map might look like. But we've got to be very careful when we talk to the Russians about the map. We do not have hundreds of thousands of troops available to march into Ukraine. We don't. They're strung out from Estonia all the way to Romania in penny packets. We have no force on the ground that is capable of resisting the Russians. We don't. Our forces are anachronistic. They're not adapted to a way of warfare that they have yet to see. That's a way of warfare that involves top attack and very little protection from it. So we've got to be very careful about what we suggest or recommend. The best we could do, I think, is what President Teddy Roosevelt did with the Japanese at the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. The Japanese had clearly defeated the Russians. But President Roosevelt, who saw the Japanese differently from everyone else in Europe, saw them as a rising major power in the world at the time, and did not see them as evil or bad or some sort of menacing presence. He said, don't be too stringent in your demands. The future will be different, and you will have an opportunity to expand your influence and your power without going to war. Well, we all know that ultimately failed miserably because he had no control over decisions that were made later. But I think we could borrow a page from Teddy Roosevelt's handbook and say, Moscow, you've won. No question about it. It's over. Tell us what your minimal demands are, and then we'll talk about what else you may want. But it may be in your interest to be generous as opposed to being too demanding, and see what happens. But understand that we don't have very much influence anymore. Why would anyone in Moscow listen to us, Glenn? We've lied so often, so frequently. And then you read what people are saying inside of Washington about the Russians, all of which is lunacy and nonsense and untruthful, and talk about, well, how we could eventually harm Russia in the future. That's ridiculous. You got to get out of that mode. And that's something that only President Trump can do. But I don't know what his inner circle is advising him to do. I worry because my experience with most of them is not good. So we'll have to see. I just don't know.
Yeah, well, I think that's another dilemma the Russians are faced with, though, because of course the key demand has to be neutrality for Ukraine, as you suggested. But my concern is that their territorial demands are excessively harsh, perhaps because they're quite suspicious that this whatever deal we make with the Russians in terms of neutrality for Ukraine, that the next government or even the same one will simply walk away from it and ignore the deals that were made, as has happened too many times in the past. On the other hand, if they try to reassure their own security by going for excessive territory, essentially going for overkill, it would leave a too ugly peace, something that would fuel hate and resentment, not just in Ukraine, but also militarize relations across these dividing lines, which NATO primarily has made in Europe. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, to find a sweet spot in the middle. But anyways, I run out of time, so I just want to thank you again, Colonel, very much for your time. So I hope to see you again here sometime later.
Thank you, Glenn. My best to everybody in Norway.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.